My name is Adam Heisey. I'm an economist working on the BlueSky prototype project at EIA. Today, I will be doing a short presentation on the model and code documentation available in our Github repo. So let's go ahead and dive in. First off, from our main GitHub repository for BlueSky, we can see that there is a link to documentation in our table of contents. So we'll go ahead and click on documentation. And here we'll highlight two different types of documentation and kind of cover these just briefly. First, I will cover model documentation. And then next, I will cover the kind of code documentation and talk about those two different things. So first, the model documentation is more of the theory and mathematical equations associated with each of the modules. And these are housed in each of the modules. It's housed on the README file, the main README file for each kind of subdirectory. And these hyperlinks will help you get there more efficiently. So we'll go ahead, for example, if we're looking at the electricity module, we want to look at the model documentation. We'll click on model. And this brings up the model documentation for the electricity model. And here we can see how the data is prepared, some different settings that are available, as well as an overview of each of the kind of the sets and the parameters and the overall, the variables and objective function, kind of the math behind the model itself. And so this is a great resource, and each module has one of these documents to explain. Really great resource for understanding kind of the theory and the math behind each model. Now, to kind of dive a little deeper into the code documentation, I'll kind of give a brief overview of a couple different ways to get to code documentation. One, in each of the README files, there should be a link to code documentation. So you click on code documentation, and it brings you to kind of the different methods of documentation, of code documentation. We use Sphinx to kind of auto-generate based on the code's doc strings in each of the functions. And we have three different options. We have an HTML output, a Markdown output, and a PDF file. And I'll kind of go over each of those briefly in that order. So first off, we have the HTML output. Best way to access this would be to clone the repo and download it locally. And once you have that, similar to the last video I did, you will kind of either run the GUI to run the model, and you can see this tab for code documentation, this little button here. We click on that, which will bring up the code documentation for all of the code within the BlueSky prototype. Alternatively, in our BlueSky repo, we could click on this docs folder and click on HTML documentation, this bat file. It will bring up the same information. This is, in my opinion, the best method for viewing and looking at and diving into the code documentation for the BlueSky prototype. It's got a clean look and feel. The HTML output is great. I think one of the best features is to be able to search rather than, you could click through the different packages and scripts based on this table of contents, but you could also search. So for example, if I know that I want to dive into looking at the code, I want to dive more into what the unified script does in the integrator, I could click on that. And this allows me to kind of go directly there and search. I can look at the different functions and what each of them does with an explanation. This pulls in all the doc strings. And let's say, for example, I also want to look at the source code. I could click on this green little source button, and it pulls up the actual Python code. And to go back, I just click on docs, and it goes back to here. So in my opinion, this is the best method for viewing the code documentation. However, there are some other options. We also have the option, so we'll go back to the docs README file. We also have an option for the Markdown output this would be if you wanted to view this without downloading the code. You want to just view this online. You could click this table of contents and kind of toggle between the different all the different doc strings. You can either click on these markdown files on the left, if we go back to the index, or we can kind of click through and toggle through, through the table of contents as well. So it's a little less user-friendly, but it is all available in markdown files, and generally organized by module: electricity, hydrogen, residential, and the integrator. So that is another method. And finally, if you've downloaded the code and cloned the repository to your local drive, if we go to Docs and we go to Build, you'll see a BlueSky prototype model PDF file. This is the final method. It's a very simple PDF document that has all of the doc strings for each of the functions. Sphinx pulls it through, and it's basically printed out and available on this PDF document, which you're able to search through or just kind of scroll through. So this has kind of been a brief overview of the different options for viewing code documentation, whether it's PDF, Markdown, or HTML, as well as kind of a brief overview of the model documentation.